Hello, it's Zeke with the Eastside Church of Christ in Baytown, Texas. Thanks for joining us for our Eastside Bible reading for the week of August 16th through the 22nd, 2020. Continuing on in the book of 2 Kings, and our reading there touches on King Uzziah of Judah, or Azariah, depending on how it's spelled. This Judean king started well, but he ended badly by directly disobeying God. He paid a heavy price for it. He had a co-regency with his son Jotham, who we'll talk about in just a little while. Meanwhile, in the northern kingdom in Israel, we read of a succession of kings, and we hardly begin reading about them before we read about some conspiracy that's hatched against them, and they're ultimately murdered. In Judah, Uzziah's son Jotham reigned until he was succeeded by his son Ahaz, who was one of Judah's worst and most wicked kings. Not only does he make an alliance with a pagan kingdom, he copies a pagan altar and has it replicated in Jerusalem. This is a king who seemed bent on serving a god, any god, but Yahweh. We begin this week also in the book of Isaiah, and keep in mind the huge impact that this book has on the New Testament. We find bits of the book of Isaiah in the Gospels, throughout the letters of the New Testament, and for good reason. He's not called the Messianic prophet for nothing. His book begins with God making a plea to his people to reason with him and to return to them. Then it moves on into this idyllic vision of a community wherein God reigns supreme. In chapter 6, very profound chapter, Isaiah has a vision of God. He sees God enthroned on his throne, and Isaiah is completely undone by it. He feels utterly unworthy and inadequate before God. And God tells him that he wants him to go and take a message to his people. And although God predicts that they won't listen and that judgment is coming, still, in spite of feeling utterly inadequate to do the job, Isaiah says, "Here am I, send me." This week we'll also read through the book of Micah. Micah prophesied about the same time as Isaiah, or the early part, and he warned that God was going to send the kingdom of Assyria to deliver judgment, and then later on was going to send Babylon to deliver an even greater destruction. In chapter 5, verse 2, he predicts the birthplace of the Messiah. And in chapter 6, verse 8, he gives that memorable recipe for the requirements of God for the person who would be accepted by God. What does man require of you? Or what does God require of you, O man? He asks. As we look at our reading in the New Testament this week, in Matthew, it begins to chronicle the final week, the last week of Jesus' life, and it's filled with activity. He enters Jerusalem in the manner that was predicted by Zechariah in Zechariah 9, verse 9, and immediately made waves by driving the merchandisers out of the temple. In fact, there isn't hardly anything that Jesus does during this last week that isn't predicted by one of the prophets. He has a series of run-ins with the religious leadership, and in chapter 23, he delivers a series of firmly worded woes against the scribes and the Pharisees, whom he calls hypocrites. In chapters 24 and 25, he foretells of Jerusalem's destruction, which came barely 40 years later, and of a later, future, and final judgment of all mankind that would take place. Our Psalms this week are only two, Psalm 9 and 10, and they're all about the judgment and the justice of God. Read those Psalms carefully and see if you don't notice the psalmist's absolute trust in God's ability to make the most fair and needed decision. Well, thanks for joining us this week in our Bible reading, and we hope to see you again next week. God bless you.